For those of you who don't know, the US is hosting the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Forum for the first time in a dozen years this year. With the Big Leader Summit involving President Biden and heads of state from many of the 20 other APEC countries in San Francisco here this November. So they're all going to be here this November. And does anyone know anything about APEC? So APEC's agenda has always first and foremost been a neoliberal agenda, meaning that APEC was created to help big corporations rig the rules of the global economy in their interests. It's a venue for government officials and CEOs and other powerful interests to meet and discuss their ideas about what they want for the global economy. So while they're having these discussions, the Biden administration very much wants something to announce that demonstrates the US commitment to and power over the Asia-Pacific region. And so that something is called IPEF, which is the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework Agreement. APEC is the discussion forum, and IPEF is the binding pact that's expected to be announced there. And the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework is a massive new trade proposal that's poised to set rules governing 40% of the global economy in and of itself, and also it's set to become the new model for subsequent trade deals the US is already negotiating in Africa, the Americas, and Europe. Sort of how NAFTA was a model for subsequent trade deals afterwards. So there's a ton at stake here. There's so much at stake. There's so many actions that are going to be held in the coming days. There was an action that was held already today at the Bay Bridge. And what we're going to do here today is we're going to talk about how trade attacks have hindered action on climate change and how climate change disproportionately impacts people of color and in the global south. And then we'll follow it up with the Q&A and description of many of the upcoming actions this week. And so there's so many amazing actions that are happening. And we just want to make sure that folks here have some context as to why we're doing these actions and what's really at stake here. So with that, I'm going to introduce our first speaker, Alana Solomon. Alana represents the Trade Justice Education Fund, where she helps lead campaigns at the intersection of trade justice and climate justice. She is also president of Solomon Strategies, LLC, which supports progressive organizations and institutions to build and lead successful campaigns. She previously led the Sierra Club's Responsible Trade Program.
Hello, everybody. How are you doing tonight? Feeling good? Wednesday night, talking about trade and climate, corporate trade deals. Really pleased you all came out. Again, my name is Ilana, here representing the Trade Justice Education Fund in Washington, D.C., where I am based. I'm excited to talk to you all tonight about trade and climate and how corporate-driven trade deals are undermining climate action, but more importantly, what we all can do about it. So, next slide was going to be helping me manage slides tonight. This is a very brief history of trade that I'll be talking through, just to do some level setting. And I think the really key point here is that our global trading system has evolved from one in the 1940s to the 1970s that was primarily about reducing the tariffs or the import taxes on goods so that goods would flow more freely and firms would earn more money. It has transitioned from that into a system that is not about removing tariffs on goods. The tariffs are basically all eliminated, but it is about removing standards, safeguards, regulations, like food product labels or toxic regulations or pollution controls so that corporations can earn more, trade more, invest more, again, make more profits. So it was really sort of founded and institutionalized through this agreement, the General Agreement on Tariffs of Trade, which was created in 1947. That really was about tariffs, but it shifted dramatically in the 1990s, the neoliberal era, that was, started really in the 1980s. We saw the signing of the North American Free Trade Agreement in 1992, which was a vast departure, starting again to move away from just tariff elimination, but safeguard elimination. In 1995, the World Trade Organization was established. That was both a forum for discussion, but also a set of rules and agreements that went far beyond, again, this tariff reduction to what's called non-tariff barriers. Those truly are safeguards and regulations, again, on chemicals, labels, things like that. And now that the World Trade Organization has been stalled for many, many years, largely on the protest of developing countries that are countries in the global south that are often on the losing side of these trade agreements, there's been a massive proliferation of smaller free trade agreements between two countries, sets of countries, that go even further and even more restrictive than the WTO. And that is, of course, problematic for many reasons, including that in order to combat the climate crisis, we need really strong government incentives, regulations, and safeguards, which butt against these now proliferated free trade rules, so-called free trade. Next slide. Now that we've done a little bit of level setting on trade, we'll do a little bit of level setting on climate. And all that is to say, you all may be familiar with Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the leading scientific body on climate, and it has made clear that allowing the planet to warm more than 1.5 degrees compared to pre-industrial levels risks what they say is crisis after crisis for the vulnerable people, societies, and irreversible loss of the most fragile ecosystems. We are all here, we know and have been witnessing the impacts of climate change globally. Floods in Pakistan, for example, here in California, we'll talk a lot more about that, including here in Berkeley, fires as just one example. And of course, these impacts are not felt equally among people, but are felt hardest among those most vulnerable, those traditionally marginalized, low-income communities, color, women, those who have done the least to create the crisis are suffering the brunt of the crisis, which is what got me into climate change and this fundamental injustice at the center of this conversation. Next slide. So recognizing the catastrophic consequences of inaction in 2015, 196 governments came together to adopt what's called the Climate Paris Agreement. It is a treaty that sets binding rules for climate action and a goal of limiting warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius, and preferably to 1.5. It is not as strong as we wanted, but it is the multilateral mechanism we have that essentially governs climate action. And right now, the world is simply, and the United States is simply not on track to meet that goal for essentially a safe, livable planet. Next slide. So closing the gap, what's it going to require? It is going to require governments, and especially developed countries, once again, those that have created the historic emissions and are the largest contributors of climate change, to dramatically ratchet up their climate ambition in the form of bold clean energy subsidies, stronger regulations on pollution, bans on fossil fuel production, incentives to create new, clean, green energy jobs, building our clean economy future, and more. And all of this goes back to the original slide, which is that all requires the flexibility of governments to be able to invest in their society and in the environment in a way that will constrain fossil fuel, in this case, corporations. And that is essentially the rub with where climate change is butting up against our free trade system. So let's talk a little bit, next slide, more specifically about how trade will threaten climate action. Go to the next slide. So the first is that they dramatically increase corporate rights, right? Remember, this is not about tariffs anymore. This is about increasing the rights of multinational corporations. And this is the most stark, in some ways, example of this. And that is that trade agreements, trade and investment agreements, actually give foreign corporations, multinational corporations, the right to sue governments in private trade tribunals over nearly any law or policy that that investor alleges reduces its expected future profits, reduces the value of its investment, or infringes on its so-called stable regulatory environments. I'll give an example of this to really understand what this means. But in some, corporations elevate it to the level of a nation state empowered to sue governments and private trade tribunals over public interest policies. These are not hypothetical. By the end of 2022, the known is important because it's such a secretive system that we don't even know all the cases, but the known cases has reached over 1,200. And fossil fuel companies are the ones that are among the most using this system. So if a country, as we'll talk about, tries to, let's say, ban fossil fuel production, a fossil fuel company can sue that government in a private trade tribunal, alleging that they have lost profits because of that regulation. Fossil fuel companies have filed nearly 200 of these investor state cases against different types of government inactions. As we see governments taking further action to address climate change, we expect that number to just rise and rise. And that is not even to mention what's on the right side of the screen. Some of these are all real examples of an energy company in Germany challenging coal regulations, the same energy company challenging a nuclear phase out, but then there's also examples of in El Salvador, the government being sued for controls on mining, toxic controls in Canada, pollution cleanup in Ecuador, Chevron, was the initiator of a claim, et cetera. We can go on and on, fracking bans, et cetera. But let's bring this close to home for just a moment. And next slide. Talk about a big fossil fuel project you all may be familiar with, the Keystone XL pipeline. It would have brought dirty tar sands from Canada throughout the United States and to markets across the world. And for years, communities along the pipeline, farmers, ranchers, indigenous communities, and concerned members of the public were fighting throughout the Obama administration, later Trump and Biden, to reject the Keystone XL pipeline. Obama first rejected it, Trump unrejected it, Biden rejected it again. And in response, TransCanada, which is a Canadian energy firm, now it's called TC Energy, used the rules of NAFTA, these investor state rules. They are suing the US government in a private trade tribunal for $15 billion, saying that the rejection of the Keystone pipeline permits violated its rights as an investor, that it was granted under NAFTA for a stable and regulatory environment and for their profits. So if this case is in the pipeline, so to speak, if it moves forward, it is taxpayers, it is us, right, who would be on the hook for paying TransCanada $15 billion because of a rejected permit. Now, IPEF, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework that Will talked about, does not actually include investor state rules. That is because of years and years of amazing campaigning, groups like the Trade Justice Education Fund and many others, fighting and making these rules too politically untenable. But they do still exist in thousands of trade agreements and investment agreements that we're going to talk about later about the need to not just stop the proliferation, but start to undo the damage being done. Next slide. So in addition to trade agreements giving corporations the ability to directly challenge climate policies, it also gives governments the ability to directly challenge climate policy, and governments, amazingly, are increasingly using this right. So starting, again, with an example that's close to home, the United States Congress recently passed the U.S. Inflation Reduction Act of 2022. It isn't perfect. It does not go far enough. It does not protect communities in the way that many communities need support. And yet it is significant climate legislation that includes $370 billion in federal climate investments. Stocks say would cut pollution by approximately 40% below 2005 levels. Almost regardless of what we think, for a moment, we might have different opinions about the Inflation Reduction Act. In response to it, several countries, including the European Union, South Korea, and others, are now threatening WTO challenges, alleging that rules in the US IRA passed by our Congress violate the WTO because they incentivize the production and manufacturing of electric vehicles in the United States and in North America, which is seen as which is a violation essentially of WTO rules. So the US is now twisting itself in knots to come to agreements with various countries to try to not get sued essentially in the WTO for this climate legislation. Next slide. Outside of the US Inflation Reduction Act, that is just one example of many. You can see, for example, Indonesia is challenging the EU's restriction on palm oil-based biofuels. Japan and the EU have successfully challenged Ontario, Canada's what's called a feed-in tariff program that supports renewable energy. Malaysia's brought a case against the EU, France, and Lithuania, claiming that the EU renewable energy targets violate WTO rules. So all of these cases are posing direct threats to climate policies when we need to be ramping up climate ambition. They also present enormous legal uncertainty to governments that are looking and want certainty that when they pass climate legislation, that it will not be undone through a treating system that's unaccountable to democratically elected officials, essentially. And it also poses what's called a chilling effect. The more of these cases we see, the more governments might be nervous, especially governments with less money, to put in place climate action for fear of being challenged either by a corporation or by another government over that climate policy. It's another way that trade agreements undermine or threaten climate action. Okay, let's go to IPEF. Next slide. Will already set us up on this. A little bit more context. It was launched in May of 2022 under the Biden administration. It's a signature part of the Biden administration's trade deal. It is the United States and 13 other countries. I will not read them, but hopefully you can see them there. It includes 4 pillars. There's one on trade, but that is, again, government procurement, environment, labor, food safety, agriculture. It's not tariffs. Again, it is safeguards and regulations related to all of these critical public interest policies. There's one on supply chain resilience. That's the one that we've seen the text of. It doesn't even mention the environment, despite the need to ensure that our supply chains and in renewable energy are not built off the backs of workers, and that we know where our supply chains and renewable energy technologies are being sourced from. And with, for example, with labor, there's a pillar on the clean economy, and there's one on a fair economy. Whatever these means, they are also negotiated in secrecy. I'm going to not talk too much about that point, but happy to talk if anyone's interested more in the process. But we know very little about this, except what the pillars are, a bit about this extremely weak supply chain pillar, and thanks to years of organizing, that it does not include investor-state dispute settlement. Next slide. I think I've already covered this. This is just a little bit about what we know about IPEF, and of course, the goal again is to announce as much of the completed deal as possible when leaders come to San Francisco on November 14th. I'm going to keep going. Let's do next slide. Let's do next slide. Okay, so what do we do about it? That was a lot of bad news. So let's talk a little bit about some of the solutions. First, on ending corporate rights in trade deals. This one should speak for itself. And like I mentioned, there's essentially a emerging bipartisan consensus in the United States because of amazing organizing. That right now is not politically tenable to include these corporate rights in trade deals. There are many countries that are still partners in many countries that are still campaigning against these corporate rights and trade deals. And they exist, like I said, in hundreds, not thousands of agreements. And there are ways that we can use existing negotiations to renegotiate and exit out of these agreements, and of course to engage any administration to ensure that we will never enter into agreement again with investor-state corporate rights. Second example is to establish what we're calling a climate peace clause. So we talked about how governments are also challenging other governments' policies on climate change using different rules of the WTO. The idea here is pretty simple. Just because the rules exist doesn't mean you have to use them. And a climate peace clause that we at Trade Justice Education Fund have been calling for would essentially be a commitment of countries to say that we will not challenge another country's climate and clean energy policies. It is too important. We need to fix the rules, but that's going to take decades, and we do not have decades. So we need to have a ceasefire, a moratorium, common sense, time out, so that countries have the flexibility to put in place the climate policies they need without fear of trade litigation, while governments also try to fix the long-term problem of trade rules being incompatible with climate action. We've seen major environmental organizations, dozens of them, speak in favor of a peace clause. We've seen hundreds of state and local organizations speak in favor of it, state legislators from every state, thought leaders. So this is an idea that's beginning to gain traction, and while it doesn't solve all of the structural inequities, would be a major step towards ensuring that governments have the ability to put in place the climate policies they need. Next slide. So then there's IPEF and the environment chapter of IPEF. To date, not a single US trade agreement has ever even mentioned the words climate change. I've been involved, Will mentioned I worked for the Sierra Club many years ago. I led their trade program. We fought for what should be included in an agreement called the Trans-Pacific Partnership. We knew that it wouldn't meet the mark. It did until we fought hard against it. We are pushing at this stage for, as the negotiations are continuing, basic protections. Like, if there is going to be an agreement, then it must include obligations for countries to adopt, maintain, and implement their commitments under the Paris Climate Agreement, and not waive or weaken their climate obligations to attract trade and investment. Requirements for transparency in the supply chains of goods. Rules to protect and encourage trade in goods with low carbon intensity or carbon footprint, to discourage trade in goods with higher carbon intensity or carbon footprint are among the elements that, if IPEF moves forward, it must include. Next slide. Next slide is thank you. That is an overview, and look forward to hearing your questions and conversations. But for now, we're going to do an introduction to my amazing colleague, Tara.
Yeah. Hey, so let's just recap. We have these corporations, they're writing the rules. It's behind closed doors, it hasn't been transparent. What are the odds that IPEF is going to be a good trade? What are the odds that this is going to be something that we're going to support? You know, I'll just say this, as a member of the No to APEC coalition, you're going to hear, like, at the No to APEC actions, we kind of know, we already expect this to be a bad deal. It's not going to have the things we want it to have. They've shut us out at every level so far of negotiations, and we really need to work together to, you know, make sure our voices are heard on this. And so the one thing that I think is really important is that it's not just these lobbyists who are heard from, right? Like, you know, APEC is just going to be this summit of like lobbyists, world leaders, and CEOs. And so we really need to have more than that. We need to make sure the people's voices are heard, not just on this trade deal, but on so many other issues that are affecting all these countries. And so what I want to do here is I want to introduce my colleague, Mira. So Mira Rubio is an undergraduate and organizer at UC Berkeley. She's the person who brought us into this room today. She wanted to make sure that folks knew what was going on behind closed doors, that they knew what we were going to be in the streets for, you know, throughout this week and next week too. And so I just want to give Mira a round of applause. Mira is a fellow with the Young Black Climate Leaders Program and just an incredible organizer. And so I'm going to pass the mic to you.
All right, thank you so much for being here. I wanted to talk a little bit about how trade is going to impact us in the Bay Area specifically, also as the younger generation, what that's going to look like. So again, thank you for joining us today as we explore the critical and underemphasized intersection of climate change and APEC. So it is crucial to scrutinize APEC's approaches as we've done here today. So IPEF, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, is going to control 40% of the global economy for probably the rest of our lives. And it doesn't mention climate change once. So we cannot let them get away. We must let them know with every breath possible that we do not condone climate denialism. So we, the young people of the beautiful Bay Area, already feel climate change's profound impacts. We see the orange skies after wildfires and days of suffocating heat followed by torrential rains. So right now, we stand at a fundamental crossroads. We face the stark reality of climate change and wonder down what path world leaders will take our future. Right now, the long-held predictions by climate scientists like rising sea levels, extreme weather events, and climate degradation are all coming to life. They're no longer distant threats, but immediate challenges affecting us all. Still, I'd like to take the time today to recognize that the burdens of climate change are not born equal. Given America's long history of racism, it is by no offhand chance that the effects of climate change are most potent in communities of color. Discriminatory zoning practices and unequal funding have worked in tandem to create our current reality. Though the environment itself has no conscience, decades of policy have paved the way. Today, the climate crisis only serves to exacerbate these pre-existing problems. So just next door, in the predominantly Black and brown neighborhood of West Oakland, they face a lower life expectancy, the lowest in Alameda County, which is the county we're currently in. They have higher rates of asthma and cancer. So this is because the disproportionate number of toxic sites, such as chemical processing facilities, located in and around Oakland, which is a predominantly Black and brown city. So studies show that communities of color face a 1.5 to 2 times higher chance of living next to a toxic site. So these health concerns are alarming enough now, but sea level rise in the coming years threatens to flood these hundreds of toxic sites scattered along California's waterways. So a staggering 736 chemical processing sites in California are at risk of flooding, with an additional 173 facing threat of groundwater encroachment. So clean air and water, the necessities of our survival, are under attack. But it's not just flooding we must contend with. Our community in Alameda County faces a significant risk due to wildfires. Astonishingly, with the current state of being with wildfires, nearly 40% of properties in Alameda County face a major to severe risk of these infernos. That's not to mention how, by 2050, a haunting reality awaits us. At least 1/3 of the year will feel like 100 degrees or warmer. It hurts to imagine what the percentage of properties at risk will be then. The fabric of our daily lives is at stake, and we must act decisively to address the multifaceted challenges of the changing climate. The stark reality necessitates urgent disaster planning and mitigation strategies to safeguard health and well-being for our communities. So I thank you all for being here with me today. Because of people like you, I have hope for the future amidst these out-of-touch politicians and corporations, what's happening right now with APEC. So I encourage you all to make your voices heard this Sunday at the mass mobilization in San Francisco and March as APEC negotiations begin. Thank you.
So I wanted to open up the questions and answers. So if folks have questions, feel free to raise your hands, or folks on Zoom. Oh, we got a question already?
So this is from Sheldon saying, given that Congress doesn't seem to be playing a role, not able to vote on it, right? What's the best way that climate groups can engage on this? The way that we engage on the TPP? You want to answer?
Give it a go. Great question. So that's actually a major, like really, between Congress and the administration, where Congress does have authority over trade. And Congress believes that they should and must have not just a say over IPEF, but a vote. And they can bring it for a vote, and it is still really critical for members of the public and everyone here and all of your friends and family and fellow students and more to be reaching out to their member of Congress. And members of Congress are being outspoken right now, engaging the US trade representative that is part of the US government in negotiating these trade deals on what needs to be in, what needs to be out, that consultations need to happen. And it likely, if it actually does get finished, will be brought to a vote by Congress. So you can absolutely still be engaging your members of Congress. The US Trade Representative does host what's called listening sessions for many of these trade agreements. We can absolutely share opportunities. It is really important that those so-called listening sessions are not just corporate advisors and corporate interests, and that is another opportunity for concerned members of the public to speak out. And then there's things like writing an op-ed or a letter to the editor in your local newspaper just to really increase education and awareness. And trade justice certainly has many tools to help folks engage in whatever way feels right to you. Would anyone else like to add to that?
I just want to note that the listening sessions that they have on IPEF are at 6 a.m. Pacific time.
Damn it.
Those are the listening sessions have been. And I've been to one or two of them, and it's mostly lobbyists, like old guys, bunch of books behind them, golf clubs in the background. And somehow seriously, they have like golf clubs in the background. And the thing that was striking besides the fact that it was an incredibly not diverse group of voices there, but it was also striking in the fact that they knew the order in which they'd be called on. And we didn't know when we were going to be called on. So we just had to wait there for hours and hours until we were called on at like 6 a.m. Pacific time. And that's when all of the listening sessions have been. They've done this so many times, but it's always at 6 a.m. And so I have to find someone each time. I have to ask a random person, usually people who work for a living, who have things to do, to come on Zoom at 6 a.m, wait an indefinite period of time, and hope that their voices are heard amongst the sea of lobbyists. That's not fair. How is that a democratic process at all? That's embarrassing. But that's one thing that you can do is show up.
My recommendation.
Any other questions or thoughts? Yes.
To what extent, if at all, any discussion with these trade agreements about bestowing rights to the environment itself? And as such an idea that was briefly mentioned, I think in 2004 with the Alba Trade Alliance, has that gained any more tractions in 2020?
That's a really good question. I just want to repeat it. So you're saying you're asking about, are there any fit provisions or is there anything being talked about in these trade agreements that would give rights to the environment itself? I have a guess what the answer is, but I'm gonna ask.
You're good.
My guess is no. That's the guess. It's probably no.
But the question was asked in the context of such rights existing in a trade agreement, known as ALBA, the World Barring Alliance of the Americas. You know, like that, like the way we're here talking about what is possible with international trade agreements with regards to environmental rights and climate change protections. You know, is there an example that exists? I ask questions, I know the answer.
Yeah, and I think that's really important too, because people aren't talking about that enough, and it's something that really should be part of the conversation. You know, I think that that's something that is an innovative and smart idea that isn't talked about enough.
Yeah.
Like, it's not something that trade negotiators seem to care about. Instead, they care more about, you know, how is this going to benefit U.S. corporations? How is this going to benefit U.S. dominance in the Asia-Pacific region? Not how is it going to benefit the actual environment? How is it going to benefit the planet? Or how is it going to benefit, you know, ordinary folks like us?
I mean, I would just, since appreciate the question, and the answer is no in the US context, right? Like, and I don't even know because I haven't seen the text, but I can guarantee the answer is no in this context right now. But you're right to start the exercise. What is trade, right? What are trade tools? It is not, in my opinion, right? It is not an end in and of itself, as it is a means to achieve a policy or political outcome. It should be, right, a tool to raise climate ambition or protect the public interest or support our workers or support, the rights of nature and the environment. So let's think about that, right? What do we want these agreements to look like? I've, in my time working on trade, I've been, I'm anti-trade on this. It's just like, no, I care about what we trade. I care about how we trade. I care about who controls it. I care about who makes the rules. So we have this opportunity. Let's talk about it. What should be in it? What are we going to call for? Like investor state dispute settlement, the corporate rights. People fought and they won. Like, that's a pretty big success that this the corporate rights are not in. It's not even a discussion. It was politically infeasible. So how do we make what we want to see the political norm? I think is the point that I heard from your excellent question.
And I think that's a good exercise. Like, we need to envision what our future could look like if we have a say. Yes.
So were you saying we know for a fact
No.
that ISDS
Oh.
is not in
Correct.
this regime?
Yeah, I think we know for a fact.
That really hurt Hillary Clinton in 2016. She came out for TPP, and that was in it. And then she flipped and said, "Oh, I rethought now I'm against it." But a lot of people didn't believe her, and so I think that really hurt her. And it's nice to hear that it has now really come a long way then to get that out of it.
Yep, through our campaigning. It was not right, this is not, it was probably painful, right, for some of our politicians to agree to not include the system of corporate rights, but we left them, the community, left no other option. It was just politically unviable, and it remained so, and the Biden administration was clear about that from pretty much day one.
Any other questions before we get into what's coming up? Yeah.
Well, so California is really innovative when it comes to passing climate laws, especially more than the US as a whole.
Yep.
And I guess I could just look this up, but I wanted to ask has ISDS ever been used against state laws, or how does that work compared to federal laws?
Yeah. So it absolutely could be. Yeah, awesome. It certainly could be. This is not a US example, but it's just one example. In Canada, province of Quebec had put in place a moratorium on fracking underneath the St. Lawrence River, and a Canadian company that had a shell office, we understand, in the United States, used rules of NAFTA to sue the government, I guess it was the government of Alberta, the Quebec, sorry, thank you, for the fracking moratorium is one example. So it's absolutely possible. It is also possible, remember we talked about these government-to-government cases. India had put in place a national solar program that would incentivize the production of solar panels made in India. Fantastic, they should. The United States used, under the WTO, challenged India's national solar program, saying that it essentially disadvantaged US exporters of solar panels into India's market, and India violated the WTO rules. India reciprocated by challenging the solar policies of 8 US states that also used what's called local content rules to encourage the production of solar panels in those states. A perfect example of why we need a climate peace clause. We have 2 countries that are trying to invest domestically in building up the renewable energy industries, as every country should have the right to do. And yet they are using time, energy, taxpayer dollars to challenge each other's policies. Interestingly, just in the last 2 months, the US and India agreed to drop a set of cases, 8 cases, and including those 2, so they are no longer under dispute, which is actually, I think, a really important win and a point to show what a climate peace clause could look like. That it is, the threat is still out there, absolutely, and California as a leader is absolutely at risk.
Thanks. Any more questions? Yeah.
So, I remember there was a time United States for trust busting, I guess it's called. Is there a mechanism, at least in the United States, to essentially backtrack for these ISDS?
Yeah,
Is there a mechanism in the United States to essentially either repeal or backtrack?
Yeah. There is, it would take renegotiation. There's several different, and we can point to some more resources because it gets pretty legal and it gets pretty wonky. But one is just renegotiating the agreements to eliminate investor state. There's something called withdrawal of consent that a government might literally just be able to withdraw consent for the investor to be able to challenge the domestic regulations. So it is a hard challenge because it exists in so many places, but there are various pathways that we can begin, and people are beginning to work to undo the rules that already exist.
Follow-up question on that. Isn't the premise of all of these regulations a waiver of sovereign immunity that will be within these agreements? When like a simple federal bill like reinserting sovereign immunity or such things cover all of them?
Someone might have a better answer. Yeah, go for it.
So, I'm not an attorney.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Arthur Simolis, Trade Justice. So I'm an organizer, I'm not an attorney. But as I understand the hierarchy of law, you have the US Constitution, then you have international law taking precedent over domestic law. So it does get sort of complicated. We apply it very selectively.
Exactly.
Very selectively. And so, in my view, we should be doing things like having international law that sets floors for environmental regulations, floors for human rights, floors for labor rights, floors for food safety. Instead, we have a system that creates ceilings, right? You can have this much food safety standard, you can't go above that. You can have this much sort of environmental protection, you can't go above that. Doesn't have to be that way. That's the way it is now. And, part of it is a legal question, but most of it is a power question. Are we going to organize to undo that system?
Yeah. And maybe to add one more point to that, very well stated. Great. As Arthur said, we apply these, we look at international norm standards and laws selectively. So the UN, the Paris Climate Agreement that I mentioned is a legally binding agreement. It is just that there are no penalties for not adhering to it. If you do not adhere to your trade obligations, look at TransCanada, $15 billion. You can put tariffs on other countries' goods. It is just as binding, but one has an enforcement regime and one has binding financial penalties. So which in the hierarchy will you as a government listen to? Is the one where you get digged billions of dollars if you don't follow the rules? And that's the whole hierarchy of how trade trumps climate and how we need to flip that hierarchy so that climate and safe public health and well-being of our communities trumps trade, right? Because trade has to be in service of these things, and right now it is not.
Thanks. So I'm gonna switch it over to talking about kind of the upcoming actions that are happening. I think are there any members of some of the student groups who are gonna talk about the stuff happening on the 15th? Okay, cool. So first, I'll just quickly talk. Tomorrow, there's going to be a rapid response emergency action. We found out where the IPEF negotiations are. We're going to hold a rally outside. Feel free to scan this QR code, the RTP, and to get more info on that. You'll see it all over the. Pretty big, hopefully. And then on the 11th and 12th, there's going to be a counter summit, and on the 12th there'll be like a really big counter mobilization as well. It'll be a huge mobilization. I think it's being combined with some of the stuff that's also some of the other actions that are happening as well. So it'll be kind of the largest mobilization against APEC that will be impacted. It's going to be San Francisco, and there's more info. You scan that QR code. You can also find out more on the No to APEC Coalition website or Big Climate Action. And then on the 15th in Berkeley, I have a couple students here who are going to talk about this.
Hi, yeah. So in addition to folks like Trade Justice organizing with the National No to APEC Coalition, there's also many student groups on campus that have been doing similar work for the past few months. And I'm part of the League of Filipino Students on campus. We are a grassroots youth student organization that fights for genuine democracy and national liberation in the Philippines. And in collaboration with many other student groups on campus, we have been planning this action on the 15th, so that a week from today, on Wednesday, to confront the APEC Study Center Consortium Conference. So in addition to all of the global leaders and CEOs coming into San Francisco for the upcoming week for the APEC Summit, there will also, Berkeley itself has an APEC Study Center on campus, and that is the study center, it's one of 70 global study centers for APEC that produce the scholarship and research needed to inform the really anti-people and anti-environment trade policies that APEC promotes. And so on Wednesday, there's going to be this consortium conference where all of the global APEC Study Center leaders will be convening on campus. So we are organizing an action against it. It'll start at the main program is from 8 to 10 a.m. So there will be speeches, chants, and performances. And it'll be outside Philosophy Hall. It'll be outside where the consortium conference is occurring. And then there will also, that's incorrect. It's 3 to 4:30 p.m. the teach-in itself, and it'll also be outside Philosophy Hall. It'll be similar to today, a teach-in about APEC study centers and the impact of and their impacts on environment, on women, on workers. And yeah, we have some flyers to hand out, and we also on this QR code, which is the same one on the flyer, there's also a petition opposing the fact that UC Berkeley is hosting this study center consortium on campus. So yeah, we would really love if y'all can share the petition, make it out to the 15th, and also especially for any Berkeley-based folks, but especially students who are planning to move out on the 12th. Feel free to reach out to me, because we are organizing a contingent of Berkeley-based people who are mobilizing on the 12th, because there are going to be so many, thousands of people there. So if y'all want a group of folks to go with, please all stick around afterwards. So please feel free to come up to me so that we can also get in touch and get y'all into the communications of all of the Berkeley students who will be mobilizing. We're expecting around 100 or so at the moment. So yeah, if you want to get looked into that, please come to me after. Thank you.
Really exciting. I think it's a really important set of actions that you can take part in if you're a Berkeley student or someone in the Berkeley community. Also on the 15th in San Francisco, there's going to be kind of a mass mobilization happening as well, kind of in the morning. This is mostly for folks who aren't necessarily UC Berkeley students. They're going to go out there and cause some trouble, and then there's going to be a labor rally that's being held by the San Francisco Labor Council and the State Labor Code, kind of talking about the labor aspect, and that's going to be at 4 p.m. in San Francisco. But for the Berkeley students and the Berkeley community, definitely recommend checking these out as well. So with that, I'll end the panel. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming out here, and we'll be sticking around a little bit. Please feel free to eat all of the pizza and drink all of the drinks that are here. Thank you all.